Kwame sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty space beside him. It had been a year since Nondi passed away. His heart ached every time he looked at her side of the bed. He refused to move her pillow, her favorite blanket, or even the small stuffed elephant she loved as a child. Everything was the same, as though she might return any moment. That night, as the city outside buzzed with life, Kwame turned off the lights and lay down. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic and the occasional distant bark of a dog. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Instead, memories of Nondi flooded his mind, her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she was happy, the sound of her voice. Suddenly, Kwame felt something odd. His side of the bed was cool, as usual, but Nondi's side felt warm. He sat up quickly, his heart racing. It had been cold for a year, why was it warm now? He reached out hesitantly, touching the blanket. It felt as if someone had just been lying there. He looked around the dark room, trying to find an explanation, but nothing seemed out of place. His hands trembled as he whispered her name. Nondi. There was no answer, but he thought he saw a faint shimmer in the moonlight streaming through the window. He shook his head. I must be imagining things, he muttered, lying back down. But the warmth didn't fade. It stayed, comforting yet unsettling. The next morning, Kwame woke up groggy and confused. Her side of the bed was cold again, just as it had been for the past year. He tried to brush it off, but the feeling lingered all day. At work, he barely paid attention to his tasks. His colleagues noticed, but Kwame dismissed their concerns with a forced smile. That night, when he returned home, he felt a strange pull to the bedroom. He stood at the door, staring at the bed. His heart told him something had changed. When he finally lay down, the warmth returned almost immediately. This time, it was accompanied by a faint smell, a mix of lavender and vanilla. Tears filled his eyes as he clutched her pillow. He didn't understand what was happening, but deep inside, a tiny spark of hope flickered. Perhaps Nondi wasn't gone after all. The third night, Kwame approached the bed with both dread and anticipation. He had spent the entire day trying to convince himself that the warmth and smell were just his imagination. Yet, when the sun set and he stepped into the bedroom, it felt as though the air itself was heavier, charged with something he couldn't explain. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding Nondi's pillow. If you're here, he whispered, his voice trembling, give me a sign. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to lie down, the faintest breeze brushed past him. The windows were closed, and there was no fan. Kwame froze, his heart pounding. I miss you so much, he said, tears welling in his eyes. I can't let go. The breeze came again, this time stronger. It was as if someone had exhaled near his cheek. Kwame's chest tightened. He wasn't sure if he was terrified or overwhelmed with joy. He lay down cautiously, pulling the blanket over himself. The warmth returned instantly. This time, it wasn't just the warmth. He felt a weight, light, almost imperceptible, press against his shoulder. Kwame didn't dare move. His mind screamed for him to run, but his heart told him to stay. He closed his eyes tightly, clutching the blanket. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually, exhaustion took over. When Kwame woke the next morning, the warmth and weight were gone, but something else had changed. Nondi's stuffed elephant, which had sat untouched on her side of the bed for a year, was now lying beside his pillow. He stared at it, his hands shaking. This isn't possible, he muttered, picking up the small toy. But the faint scent of lavender and vanilla lingered on it. He spent the day in a daze, replaying the events of the night over and over in his mind. Was he losing his grip on reality? Or was Nondi truly reaching out to him from beyond? That evening, he did something he hadn't done since her funeral. He spoke to her picture. Nondi, he said, holding the framed photo of her smiling face, if this is really you, please don't leave me again. I don't know how to do this without you. The picture didn't answer, of course, but when he turned around, he thought he saw a shadow move across the wall. He spun quickly, but nothing was there. As the nights went on, the warmth, the smell, and the weight grew stronger. Kwame started hearing faint whispers in the middle of the night, though he couldn't make out the words. One night, he felt something brush against his hand, a touch so soft it could have been a breeze, but deep inside, he knew it wasn't. His friends began to notice his change in behavior. He was more withdrawn, spending less time at work and more time at home. His best friend, Yao, confronted him. "Kwame, you've been acting strange," Yao said over coffee. "You're barely sleeping, and you look like you've seen a ghost." Kwame chuckled nervously. "What if I have?" Yao frowned. "Don't joke about that, man. You've been through a lot, but you need to move on. Nondi wouldn't want this for you." Kwame didn't respond. He wanted to tell Yao the truth, but he was afraid of what his friend might think. That night, as he lay in bed, he whispered, "Nondi, if this is really you, show me something I can't deny." For the first time, he heard her voice. "Kwame," she whispered, so faintly it could have been a dream. His breath caught in his throat. "Nondi." "Yes," the voice said, soft but unmistakable. "I'm here." Kwame bolted upright, his heart pounding. He looked around the dark room, but there was no one there. "Nondi," he whispered again, his voice trembling. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. He began to doubt himself. Had he really heard her voice, or was it just his imagination? Then, the scent of lavender and vanilla washed over him, stronger than ever before. "I'm here," the voice said again. Kwame's hands trembled as he clutched the blanket. How? How is this possible? There was no answer, but the warmth by his side intensified. It felt as though someone was sitting next to him. His eyes darted to the empty space, and for a split second, he thought he saw the faint outline of a figure. "Nondi," he said, tears streaming down his face, "I've missed you so much." The warmth shifted, and he felt the lightest pressure on his shoulder, as if someone was resting their hand there. His breath hitched. "Why did you leave me?" The whisper came again, softer this time. "I never left." Kwame spent the rest of the night talking to the unseen presence. He poured out his heart, sharing his grief, his regrets, and his longing. For the first time in a year, he felt a glimmer of hope. But the next morning, reality came crashing back. The room was cold, the bed empty, and Nondi's stuffed elephant was once again on her side of the bed. Kwame stared at it, his heart heavy. At work, he couldn't focus. Yao noticed his distracted state and tried to talk to him again, but Kwame brushed him off. How could he explain what was happening without sounding crazy? That night, the whispers returned, clearer than before. "Kwame," Nondi's voice said, "you need to help me." His chest tightened. "Help you? How?" "I'm stuck," she said, her voice fading in and out. "I need you to let go." The words sent a chill down Kwame's spine. "Let go? I don't understand." "I can't let you go, Nondi. I love you." The warmth by his side grew colder. "If you don't let go," she said, her voice filled with sorrow, "I'll never be free." Kwame's heart broke at her words. He didn't want to lose her again, but he also didn't want her to be trapped in whatever limbo she was in. "Tell me what to do," he whispered. Her reply was faint but clear. "Find the bracelet." Kwame's eyes widened. He remembered the bracelet she had always worn, a delicate silver chain with a small charm. She had been buried with it. "Are you saying I need to?" He couldn't finish the sentence. The warmth disappeared completely, leaving him alone in the cold, dark room. The next morning, Kwame visited the cemetery where Nondi was buried. He stood at her grave, his heart heavy with uncertainty. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. But deep down, he knew he couldn't ignore her plea. He had to find the bracelet, no matter the cost. Kwame stood at Nondi's grave, his hands shaking. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery. He felt a deep chill, not from the evening air but from the weight of what he was about to do. He glanced around nervously. The cemetery was quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling trees and distant city traffic. He had brought a small spade with him, hidden under his jacket. His heart pounded as he knelt by the grave, whispering under his breath. "Nondi, If this is really what you want, please, give me strength. For a moment, he hesitated. Disturbing her grave felt wrong, almost like a betrayal. But her voice echoed in his mind, find the bracelet. Summoning every ounce of courage, Kwame began to dig. The earth was heavy and damp, and each scoop felt like it weighed a ton. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his arms ached, but he didn't stop. The thought of helping Nondi kept him going. As the hours passed, the grave deepened. Finally, the spade hit something solid. Kwame froze, his breath catching in his throat. He brushed the dirt away carefully, revealing the wooden coffin beneath. Tears filled his eyes as he stared at it. I'm sorry, Nondi, he whispered. With trembling hands, he pried the lid open. Inside, Nondi lay just as he remembered her features peaceful and untouched by time. She still wore the dress he had chosen for her, and on her wrist was the silver bracelet. Kwame reached out, his fingers hovering over her wrist. Suddenly, the air grew icy, and the scent of lavender and vanilla filled the grave. A soft whisper brushed against his ear. Thank you, Kwame. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he unclasped the bracelet. The moment it left her wrist, a strange warmth spread through his body. He felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted, and for the first time in a year, his heart didn't ache as much. But before he could climb out of the grave, a sharp sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Kwame froze, his heart racing. He peered over the edge of the grave and saw a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. A security guard was making his rounds. Panic surged through him. He quickly closed the coffin and covered it with dirt, walking as fast as he could. The footsteps grew louder, and the light was getting closer. Who's there? The guard called out. Kwame's hands moved frantically, but there was no way he could finish in time. The guard's light swept over him, and he froze like a deer in headlights. You, the guard shouted. What are you doing? Kwame's mind raced. He clutched the bracelet tightly in his hand and stammered, I'm visiting my wife. At this hour. And with a spade. The guard's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. Kwame's heart pounded. Please, you don't understand, he said, his voice desperate. I had to come. She needed me to do this. The guard stared at him, clearly unconvinced. You're coming with me. We'll let the police sort this out. Kwame's chest tightened. He couldn't let anyone take the bracelet. He had to finish what Nondi asked of him. Summoning his courage, he bolted past the guard, clutching the bracelet tightly. Hey! Stop, the guard yelled, but Kwame didn't look back. He ran through the cemetery, his lungs burning and his legs screaming for rest. The guard's shouts faded behind him as he reached the street and disappeared into the night. Back in his apartment, Kwame locked the door and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. He opened his hand and stared at the bracelet. It shimmered faintly, as if alive. What now, Nondi? He whispered. The answer came almost immediately, a soft, familiar voice that filled the room. Put it on. Kwame stared at the bracelet in his hand, unsure of what to do. It felt warm, almost pulsing, as if it had its own heartbeat. Nondi's voice had been clear, but the idea of putting it on filled him with both fear and curiosity. Put it on, her voice echoed again, softer but insistent. With a deep breath, Kwame slipped the bracelet onto his wrist. The moment the clasp clicked into place, a wave of energy surged through him. His vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin. He clutched his head, gasping for air. When the dizziness passed, he realized he wasn't alone. There she was. Nondi. She stood in the middle of the room, her figure bathed in a faint, golden light. She looked just as she had in life, radiant, with her warm smile and kind eyes. Nondi. Kwame whispered, his voice trembling. She nodded, her smile tinged with sadness. It's me. Kwame stumbled to his feet, his emotions overwhelming him. How is this possible? I thought you were gone. I was, she said, stepping closer to him. But I was trapped between worlds. The bracelet was the anchor that held me here. Now that you freed me, I can speak to you one last time. One last time. Kwami's heart sank. I don't want to lose you again. Nandi reached out, her hand brushing his cheek. It felt warm, real. You haven't lost me, Kwami. I've always been with you, but you need to let go. Holding on to me this way is keeping both of us from moving forward. Kwami's eyes filled with tears. But I don't know how to live without you. Every day feels empty. Nandi's expression softened. I know it's hard, but you're stronger than you think. You have so much life ahead of you, Kwami. You need to let me rest, and you need to find your own peace. Kwami shook his head, the thought of saying goodbye unbearable. I don't want to let you go. She leaned in, pressing her forehead to his. You're not letting me go, Kwami. You're setting me free. The golden light around her began to grow brighter, enveloping her in a warm glow. Kwami's chest tightened as he realized what was happening. Nandi, wait. Please don't go. Her smile was filled with love. I'll always love you, Kwami. And I'll always be in your heart. The light intensified, and Nandi's form began to fade. Kwami reached out, but his hand passed through her as if she were made of air. Nandi, he cried, but it was too late. She was gone. Kwami fell to his knees, clutching the bracelet. The room was silent again, and for the first time, it felt truly empty. Hours passed as he sat there, the weight of grief pressing down on him. But as the sun rose, a strange sense of calm washed over him. He could still feel the warmth of her presence, not in the room but deep within his heart. Kwami stood, his legs shaky but firm. He walked to the window, the bracelet still on his wrist. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't stay trapped in the past. For the first time in a long time, he whispered, "Goodbye, Nandi." And for the first time, he felt her whisper back, carried on the morning breeze. Goodbye, Kwami. The days that followed were filled with an aching quiet. Kwami kept the bracelet, not as a reminder of his grief but as a symbol of the love he shared with Nandi. It no longer shimmered or pulsed with warmth, it was simply a piece of silver, yet it held the memories of their time together. Life slowly began to take shape again. Kwami returned to work, though the first few days were difficult. Yao, ever persistent, convinced him to grab lunch one afternoon. Over bowls of steaming jollof rice, Yao finally broke the silence. You seem different, Kwami, he said, studying his friend's face. Kwami nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. I've made peace with Nandi. Yao raised an eyebrow, surprised but relieved. That's good to hear. She'd want you to be happy. The words hit Kwami like a gentle wave. Yes, Nandi would want him to be happy. That thought became his anchor as he started to rebuild his life. One evening, as he walked home from work, Kwami passed a small art gallery. The soft glow of lights caught his attention, and he stepped inside. The gallery was hosting an exhibit on love and loss, with pieces that spoke directly to his soul. As he moved from one painting to the next, he noticed a woman standing a few feet away. She was studying a sculpture with a thoughtful expression, her dark curls framing her face. Something about her presence felt familiar, comforting. Kwami hesitated but decided to approach her. Beautiful piece, isn't it? He said, nodding toward the sculpture. She turned to him, her eyes warm and kind. It is. It reminds me of how love leaves an imprint, even when the person is gone. Kwami's breath caught. Her words resonated deeply with him. That's a beautiful way to put it, he replied. They talked for what felt like hours, moving through the gallery together. Her name was Oma, and she had a quiet strength that drew him in. For the first time since Nandi's death, Kwami felt a spark of something he thought he'd never feel again, hope. As the weeks turned into months, Kwami and Oma grew closer. She didn't try to replace Nandi, she couldn't, and Kwami didn't want her to. Instead, she became a new chapter in his life, one filled with healing and growth. One day, as they walked along the beach, Oma noticed the silver bracelet on Kwami's wrist. That's beautiful, she said. Is there a story behind it? Kwami smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There is, he said. It's a reminder of someone I love deeply. Someone who taught me that love doesn't end, even when we have to say goodbye. Oma placed her hand on his, her touch grounding him. She must have been special. She was, Kwame said, his voice steady. And because of her, I learned how to live again. The waves lapped at their feet as Kwame felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the love he had shared with Nondi, for the strength to let her go, and for the chance to open his heart once more. The bracelet no longer felt like a weight but a quiet reminder of a love that would always be part of him. And as he walked hand in hand with Oma, he realized that moving forward didn't mean leaving Nondi behind, it meant carrying her memory into a life filled with new possibilities. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Kwame smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't known in years. He was finally at peace.